Okay, go for it.
All right. Adam, the one thing I might need from you is to enable my screen share.
Yes, of course.
We're ready? Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Nice to see you guys again. And thanks, as always, for being here. It was fun. I'll share. Adam and I got to hang out, and Brad and Adam and I got to hang out at the NEC conference last week in Sacramento. So nice to see some board members in person and do a little code talk. Not related to this, of course, but related to the Department of Energy code, all the great code stuff we were learning last week. So, Brad, nice to see you again. And we'll go ahead and dive right in today. So. Our agenda for today's session. We're going to start with approval of the meeting minutes, as always. And then we have an exciting update for the board on the legislation that made it through the Colorado legislature and was approved last week. So we'll give an update on the bills that came through, what was approved, and what it's going to mean for this board moving forward. Then we're going to pass it over to Anna and go through an update on the 2024 IECC now that we have the final version. We're going to go through those appealed provisions that we learned about in previous meetings to understand where they fell and landed within the 2024 final code. Hopefully you all have had time to take a look through that draft code. If not, Anna's presentation will give us a little bit of the insights we need to kind of carry forward the conversation. And then we'll make sure that we get all of your questions answered about those pieces in particular. And then we're going to move on. Pretty much the last hour of our meeting is going to just be an open session where you all can ask Anna and Hope will be joining us at noon. Questions on the 2024 IECC. I want to thank Tim in advance. Tim shared some questions that he had in advance, so we've got a couple ones we can kick off the discussion with, but hopefully you all have a list of questions as well. And so we'll just spend time kind of talking through those questions and making sure you all really have a good grasp on what the 2024 code is requiring. And of course, we know that is a very long code and a very beastly document, so this will not be, as a reminder, the only time we get to answer questions on this, but for any questions that have cropped up with your guys' preliminary review, we'll go ahead and get those answered. And then we'll close up and talk about next steps and send you all on your way. So our objectives today are to give you all an update on the relevant legislation, where it landed and how it's going to impact you all. And this process, to give you guys an update on the 2024 IECC and where all of the appeals pieces landed, and then just really, again, that time to answer your questions. So we're going to move first, as we do, through the approval of meeting minutes. And so the meeting minutes from meeting number 5 were shared in advance of this meeting. Do I have any motions to approve the meeting minutes?
So moved.
I'll second.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Ron. All in favor of approving meeting 5 meeting minutes, please say aye.
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 Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And any opposed to approval of the meeting 5 meeting minutes, please say aye. Okay. Meeting 5. Oh, okay. Just making sure that wasn't I think that might have been just some background noise. Thank you all. Meeting 5 meeting minutes are approved, and we will get those posted on the Energy Code Board's website. And I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I'm not sure who it's from, so just a note if you are unmuted. If you could mute yourself, that'd be great. Okay, so reminder, we have a big public webinar tonight. The webinar at 4 p.m. today will be kicking off our public engagement process. And it is from 4 to 5:30. I know a couple of you have shared with us in advance that you're going to have conflicts in making this meeting, but if you're able to attend, we would love to have you there. And we would also love if you can help remind your networks or anyone you sent an email out about the webinar, just remind them that it's tonight and that it's important that they register to make sure that they have the link to attend the meeting. That is inclusive of you all. You probably saw Adam's emails a couple times. If you all want to attend the meeting, we'll ask that you register for the webinar. We won't have the panelist links sent to you all. So you all will sort of be members of the audience if you register to attend. We're really excited about this webinar. So again, just really emphasizing if you've got folks you know are interested in this or interested in partaking in the public engagement process for this board, or just want to know more about energy code and what you're doing on this board, please send them to this webinar. Yeah, we hope we'll see you guys there as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Adam to go through an update on where all of the legislation related to this board landed. So over to you, Adam.
Cool. Thanks, Kim. Everybody, I think we gave some previews of a lot of this legislation during our last meeting, but now that we have the legislative session officially over and we know the results of all these pieces of legislation, just wanted to give a few updates on a couple bills that are going to directly affect the Energy Code Board. And I guess the caveat here would be that I believe, Will, please jump in, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe the governor has signed either of these pieces of legislation yet. So they are passed the legislature, but not technically officially law until the governor signs them. But we anticipate that he will. So we can definitely move forward with that expectation. So on the first of the two pieces, Senate Bill 214, this is the bill that we talked, I think, most about last time. Essentially, there's a few elements here that are going to directly affect the Energy Code Board's schedule, as well as what content can be considered in the low energy and carbon code. So first, just a note that this has extended the Energy Code Board's deadline for publishing the low energy and carbon code from June 1st of next year to September 1st of next year. The main reason for this extension being the delay in the publishing of the 2024 IECC, and thus the delay in our ability to move forward with some robust discussions. And then, there were a couple of interim deadlines put into that were in the statute already. One is for, the deadline for when the full Energy Code Board can vote on each element of the code. The original deadline was February 1st of next year. It has now been moved to June 1st of next year. And then the deadline for the executive committee to act, if there is anything for the executive committee to act on, is now going to be August 1st, moved from March 15th of next year. So those are just some changes. We are working with the Lotus team to figure out what that is going to do to our schedule. We have not updated our schedule yet. I think we're just waiting for this to be signed into law, so we have a absolute confirmation that we are moving forward with these dates. But also we will need to rejigger our syllabus and our schedule planned for accommodating that we now have essentially 4 additional months for the full board and additional time for the executive committee if needed. So we will be working on that and provide updates to all of you a little bit down the road. And then another big piece that we also discussed a little bit in the last meeting was that there was an amendment to change the language that originally said that the Energy Code Board could use the 2021 or 2024 baseline. That has not changed, but there was language that said it could also use appendices. And given the changes that the ICC Board of Directors made to the 2024 IECC, and the removal of some of the appendices into resources, the legislation was updated to allow for the board to consider both appendices and resources that will be published as part of the 2024 IECC rather than just the appendices. So that won't necessarily change anything that the board decides to do. It's just it enables the board to consider some of that extra language. And Anna's going to talk about what some of those removed pieces were that are now resources when she talks about the updates to the 2024 in a few minutes. And then finally, there was just, additional money that was moved for the Energy Code Board to operate. So, mostly for the CEO to operate the Energy Code Board. Next slide. So maybe I guess before we actually go to the next slide, I'll see if there's any questions on Senate Bill 214. Not seeing any. If you have any that you think of later, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll answer them there too. All right, House Bill 1161. So I don't know that we've talked about this as a whole group very much. I know I've gotten a couple of questions from a couple of you about this bill that you just asked as you saw it come around. Essentially, this update is part of a larger bill that is not, so the whole bill is not just about updates to the Energy Code Board, but essentially the bill's intent is largely to make EV charging more physically accessible, so across the spectrum. And part of that is making sure that our EV ready provisions are accounting for physical accessibility, not only for the readiness spaces, but more in planning for future installation of EV chargers to make sure that we are preparing the EV charging infrastructure that will support those chargers to be able to accommodate physical accessibility needs down the road. And so this legislation essentially just updated the language that said that the Energy Code Board is required to include the model electric ready and solar ready code language in the low energy and carbon code, including any updates that the board wanted to make. So there was that was what it said originally. And then there was an addition here saying that the board needs to consider including recommendations that were made by the 4 entities there on the screen, the U.S. Access Board, the Department of Transportation, Department of Justice, and regulations in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we will be working with our transportation team at the Energy Office to identify what those resources are. And then as we get closer to our discussions about updating the electric ready and solar ready code provisions, we will be revisiting this and considering how we can best be preparing our buildings for future EV charging that is going to meet physical accessibility needs. So that's House Bill 1161, and happy to take any questions on that as well. All right, not seeing any, so I guess that's all really clear. Happy to answer any questions that come up down the road if you guys have any.
Hey, if I could add one thing
Sure.
on another piece of legislation,
Please, yes.
that I think is relevant to our EV ready and electric ready code. There was a major piece of legislation on utility distribution system planning that applies just in Excel service territory, but updates of the statutory requirements for much more proactive distribution planning that is focused on both speeding up interconnection of both solar and of new beneficial electrification load and transportation electrification load, but also for residential customers, limits the interconnection costs for both single family residential and then for all affordable housing. And so that'll be just, I think, important for us to take a look at as we are looking at any updates to the EV ready and electric ready code.
Well, and I just want to note that Tim had a question in the chat. Well, I don't know if you want to address that about why it was just Excel territory.
Yeah, so it essentially focuses on PUC regulation. So it was primarily only affecting investor-owned utilities, and was written to primarily affect our large investor-owned utility, Xcel Energy, since Black Hills has sort of very, very different economics than Xcel does. There is some general language on interconnection tariffs that potentially could apply to other utilities, but the vast bulk of the bill was designed to focus on our large investor-owned utility, where the PUC has jurisdiction.
Thanks, Bill. And what was the name, or what was the number tagged with that, Bill?
Let's see, Adam, do you happen to remember? If not, I will take a quick look.
I don't, but I can look it up easily too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, just good to know, so we can go and take a look deeper at that, and happy to share more information on that at a future meeting. Thanks for bringing that up, Bill. All right. Any other questions for Adam or Will on the three bills discussed today?
Oh, by the way, that was Senate Bill 218.
Senate Bill 218. Awesome. Thank you, Will. All right. So not hearing any questions. Again, if they come up, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna to take us through where all of the appeals pieces landed in the 2024 code. Thanks,
Sure.
Anna.
Okay. So what we're talking about today are changes from what we discussed in the previous meetings to where we are at with the code right now. And yeah, so we'll run through them. Please interrupt me if you have any questions or if any of this sparks any questions about the new code. So most of the commercial section remained the same. We talked about some of those demand response sections being moved to appendices. Those that language did not change. So I'm not gonna spend time talking through those, but if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to go through those with you. In Appendix CF, energy credits, this is the section that requires additional energy credit packages above what Section C406 requires. And they added additional language in this section which says that buildings without heat pumps are required to have 1.25 times the number of credits that buildings with heat pumps are required to have. So you would take the credit number from the table in Appendix CF and multiply it by 1.25 to get the number of credits required. The types of buildings that would require these additional credits include buildings using purchased energy that is not electricity for space heating or surface water heating. So this brings to mind, obviously natural gas, but potentially heating water or steam from a central plant. Buildings with electric storage water heaters that are not heat pumps. And buildings with total heat pump space heating capacity less than the space heating load and design it from design conditions. I'm sorry for the typo there. So if they have less heat pump space heating capacity than what would be required under design conditions, then you would be required to comply with this section.
And I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
So there was the appendix or language that we think moved to an appendix around additional efficiency required for buildings without heat pumps. Is that this, or is that
is this
integrated? Yep. Okay, so that got
it. And I'm sorry for interrupting. Kim, go ahead.
No, you go.
Yeah, so that has been integrated into this section.
Thank you.
So just to clarify, there is no additional appendix relating to the buildings without heat pumps. It's now all living in this appendix.
Correct. Except for oh boy, and I'm going to get all my appendices confused. I have a slide on it in here, but there's just so many now that it's just overwhelming. But I would have to look up which appendix it is, and I can get back to you, Adam, but there's a slide in here. Go ahead, Tom.
Does the third bullet point, does that refer to buildings that have 100% heat pumps, but also have electric resistance or gas backup, or just buildings that have less than 100% heat pump coverage? So
you are allowed to have supplementary electric heat for when your heat pumps cannot when outdoor conditions do not allow your heat pumps to function. But this is basically saying, okay, we have heat pumps in the building, but the heat pumps, you have not sized the heat pumps to handle the space heating load that's required. And so you have additional gas heating that isn't supplementary. It's more because you haven't sized the heat pumps to handle the full load. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
It does, but there's gray area too. If it's
I agree.
building that has rooftop mounted heat pumps and they stop working below 20 or 30 degrees and you have to have it. But it's
Yes, so
covered
that's what they
in
call
most of-
supplementary
Yeah,
heat, and you are allowed to have that supplementary electric heat.
but if it's gas, then they need the 1.25 times the credits.
That is my understanding.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. Rob?
Yeah, my question was in the same vein. I wanted to know what the design temperature was to define that heating capacity.
Yeah, so that's differs right by climate zone, and in Colorado, I believe it's 5 now. I have to double check. For 5B at least. Oh, we're getting some chats here.
This is just from Kristen saying a gentle reminder that heat pumps work below 0 now.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
many, but not all.
Okay. Next slide here. Okay, Appendix CI. Demand responsive controls. So those are those demand responsive controls that were moved from the base code to the appendice. They all live in Appendix CI. There are the specific requirements are listed here, but no updates from the language that we saw previously. Although Tim sent a question in, sorry, I have like 10 resources open here. So Tim asked why Appendix CI demand responsive lighting doesn't apply to A or R occupancies. And I do not know that this is fact, but here's my theory on it, Tim. Or do you want to add anything before I delve in?
I am having struggles talking. I've got a real bad head cold, so
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, I'll just ask your questions as we go through then, and then you can type if you have any comments. So Tim asked, you'll see there in the last bullet that this is only demand responsive lighting controls are only required for 75% of interior floor area in groups B, E, M, and S occupancies. My understanding, and this is kind of a theory, I guess I don't have the full reasoning behind this, but my understanding is that the requirements of group A in terms of required lighting for different assembly purposes wouldn't react well with demand responsive lighting. And then group R, my understanding is that because of the leasing requirements that building owners could potentially run into with providing that demand responsive lighting, that could make things difficult. But those are my theories that I've kind of read on. I don't have the actual language about why those groups are excluded.
And Tim said a questions on I occupancies as well.
Ooh. That's a good question. I didn't read up on that one. Let me double check. I'll look into that a little more.
Thanks, Anna. And Hope will be joining us a little bit later, and she sent a separate email, Tim, letting us know she had some thoughts on your question. So if we don't get it answered, we'll certainly follow up in an email with those.
Okay. Next slide. Appendix CJ. So that's that electrical storage system that was moved from the base code. There was some changes to sorry, I'm trying to look at the appendix while I talk. There were some updates to that section, to that language. So now they specifically say that if you can either be electric storage system ready, ESS ready, or you can provide the energy storage system on site. If the storage system is provided, it must be sized for the provided on-site renewable system. And if you are ESS ready, the energy capacity must be 0.0008 kilowatt hours per square foot of gross conditioned floor area of the 3 largest floors of the building. So some additional language around the future capacity that you have to size or create the infrastructure for. Any questions there? Okay. So then we have these resources, so appendices that were pushed into the resources by the appeals process. Resource CRB is the prescriptive glide path. So in this resource, it says specifically that, and it will always confuses me, they give you CRB before CRA. I was like, oh no, I hope I didn't. Okay. That you are required to provide 1.4 times the energy credits required in section C406. So that is the prescriptive glide path. In previous meetings, we discussed the performance glide path in providing additional energy efficiency, but now we also have the prescriptive glide path that is strictly requiring more credits than what are prescribed in section C406.
And I want to quickly call out, we got one quick question on the energy storage, so I'm going to flip back to that slide really quick.
Thanks.
And this came from Tim. Would we need to size service to accommodate the energy storage?
So the energy storage requires that on-site electrical distribution equipment shall have sufficient capacity, rating and space to allow the installation of overcurrent devices and circuit wiring for future electric ESS complying with the capacity criteria. So it sounds like to me that it does require sufficient capacity, and the service would be required to comply.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna.
Sure.
And then just to call out this in the chat from Kevin, maybe this is a question for later, but as we go through the ones that were bumped to resources, can someone speak to the preemption implications that were cited as reasons in the appeal? So Adam, or I don't know who, and I don't know if you've got those answers. Hope might have some of that when she joins as well.
I mean, we can at least just talk about what ICC said. I mean, we obviously can't infer everything that they talked about, but we can certainly talk about what they cited.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. I'll give this a shot. Tired of chatting. Never with this particular one with CRB, the glide path. So the previous slide said everything out of C406 went into an appendix CF, correct? And
so appendix CF is just an option to require additional credits. So, and we can go back through, I'm sorry, I should give you a little bit more background on appendix CF. So appendix CF is not the glide path. It just requires additional credits. So they call it the advanced energy credit package, which seeks to just require additional energy efficiency. It isn't the official glide path.
okay, and so if you could go back to the current slide where I asked the question. And so that says provide 1.4 times energy credits required in section C406. So there is a C406 anymore.
There is still a C406. Appendix CF is just if you would like to require additional efficiency above section C406.
Right, perfect. Thank you.
Sorry for the confusion.
Anna, just following up on Tim's question. So do you have any sense of between appendix CF requiring the additional credits versus the prescriptive glide path resource, how those points shake out? Are they equivalent? Does the glide path get you further? Does appendix CF get you further?
Appendix CF requires more credits than the glide path.
Okay, thank you.
In a quick spot check, I did not check every box, but I checked a few climate zones and a few typical occupancies.
And then to circle back to Kevin's question, did Adam and
sorry.
Anna, I don't know if you all have any
I don't
thoughts?
feel confident that I can
Okay.
speak to that.
Yeah, I don't feel as confident that I could speak to it on the prescriptive glide. My understanding was essentially what the ICC board said was that under the prescriptive glide path, that their interpretation was that there were not, essentially the burden was too high on gas pathways, essentially to be able to meet the requirements, is my understanding of what they said. But I will not go further than that because I am not sure I fully understand why they felt that way. Especially given that, as you just said, Anna, Appendix CF goes even further. So I don't know why this provision would have been preempted, but somehow Appendix CF was not. So, Kevin, on this one, I'm sorry. I think we will feign some ignorance here on just not fully understanding. But maybe Kristen has an answer.
I actually don't know if I have an answer, but I do think that it may be important for us to consider that there's been a lot of discussion about concerns about preemption. People citing concerns about preemption is not the same thing as specific actions or activities actually being preempted. And perhaps those who attended the DOE's code conference got some additional insights on this. But when I was at DOE, preemption around appliance standards was typically held that states could not necessarily regulate or set additional efficiency requirements for particular appliances or pieces of equipment that were regulated at a federal level, but that they were very free to set their own building codes and standards so long as we weren't, for example, trying to increase efficiency regulations on refrigerators or other products that were covered. So the relation between like that and building codes now there may be certain elements that the Code Council is citing that they're concerned that they might be crossing some lines. But again, I think here we've talked about concerns about preemption as being the same thing as preemption. And they are two very different things. So just hoping we can keep that line clear.
That was actually intentional in the way I had that, because I mean, you consider the source of the appeals. That there's some influence there for sure, and that's what I want to be. That's why I was asking to say to understand why these things were moved when they were either base or appendix, and kind of kicked out. If there's sentiment among board members to advocate for some of those to be restored or to be included as the House bill or Senate bill allowed, I want to make sure we're not tripping up on some unforeseen consequence to that.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.
I think we will definitely, I guess, to clarify, everything we talk about when it comes to preemption is all about potential risk of preemption, not actual preemption. So thank you for clarifying that, Kristen.
And I just wanted to call out, there is in the draft code that you all were sent an ICC Council policy note that gives some explanatory text as it relates to EPCA. So might be worth just perusing that as well, specifically for this resource.
And also just as a bit of an additional information, we have provided feedback to ICC that it seems very strange that optional appendices were removed for any concern of preemption, given that they were already optional. So also not entirely sure what the thinking was behind that approach, but that is feedback we've provided.
Great. So then the last resource in the commercial code is a resource CRA, the all electric commercial building provisions. So within this section, buildings must be all electric except for emergency power systems. You're permitted to have generators, whatever, that are natural gas, or they just say purchased energy. You are not allowed to use electric resistance heat for heating, except for equipment that is less than 5% of the total system heating capacity. Specific conditions that cannot be served by heat pumps. I had a hard time thinking of one, but if you have a situation where you cannot be served by a heat pump, you can use electric heating. Kitchen makeup air is still allowed to be electric resistance. You're allowed to have electric resistance freeze protection. Preheat of outdoor air for hydronic systems up to 40 degrees is allowed to be electric resistance, and then supplemental heat for heat pump backup heat when the temperatures get below the heat pump's capability. Slide.
See if there's any questions, and then we can talk about the risk of preemption related to this one as well. Oh, you're not done. Never mind. Keep going.
Uh-oh. It looks like the second slide that first slide got duplicated here. Let me.
So maybe you are done.
That's okay.
Maybe if you want to talk about the residential, and then we can talk about the potential preemption risk pieces.
Sure.
There. But I see Don has a question, so.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Don.
Yeah, in the list of exemptions there, is there, I don't see anything about makeup, standard ERV type makeup air. In cold weather applications, that's about the only option you're going to have is electric strip heat. So just curious if there was anything about ERV units at all.
So there is a note. Sorry, let me pull it here. Okay, here it is. So for hydronic systems without energy recovery, all systems with energy recovery ventilation shall be permitted to utilize electric resistance to preheat outdoor air to defrost or temper air entering the energy recovery device, and shall comply with one of the following. Basically, you can heat it to 25 degrees for you can preheat outdoor air to 25 degrees for any space that is mechanically humidified. If you have sensible only heat recovery exchangers, you can preheat to 25 degrees with the electric resistance. And for all other systems, outdoor air shall not be preheated to greater than 5 degrees.
Okay. I see some real challenges there. VRF systems are going to struggle with pumping that kind of cold air in hard winter conditions. So thank you.
And I checked our slides. I couldn't find the second slide with additional content on this appendix. So
yeah, I
okay.
didn't have one either. So must have just
okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Well, Adam, then this is the last slide. So I don't know if you wanted to chat about.
Yeah, I think we can talk about the preemption, the discussion about preemption risk here. And then, I think just keep in mind that essentially when we talk about the appendix, the all electric residential appendix, the same considerations will apply. So I think, I'm guessing everybody on this call is familiar with the decision in the Berkeley electrification lawsuit that occurred in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that essentially ruled that the city of Berkeley, and also because it was upheld by the Ninth Circuit or determined by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, that no one within the Ninth Circuit territory, which is Washington, California, Oregon, Hawaii, and Alaska, I believe, are allowed to regulate the fuel type of services provided to appliances within the building, essentially. which is kind of it's very narrow. They started with a broader interpretation saying that you basically can't say that you have prevention of gas on site at a building. And then they revised their ruling that essentially said, well, essentially from the customer meter to the appliance, you cannot essentially ban connections of gas appliances in those circumstances. And so I think that is the foundational concern that the ICC board expressed, as well as others have expressed, about requiring all electric. But so that's kind of the foundational concern and the issue. I think, though, given the statutory requirements for what this board is allowed to do with the low energy and carbon code, I don't believe we are really at any risk of adopting anything that could potentially be preempted anyway, given that the statute requires that this code have pathways for both all electric construction and mixed fuel construction. So there is no circumstance in which this board could adopt the all electric requirements as they are written, or in any form that would ban mixed fuel usage in homes or new commercial buildings. And so I am not super concerned that we are going to run into that problem given our statutory limitations. So I'll just, I guess, leave my comments there, and I see Carolyn has your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, and hopefully you can hear me. Thanks for your patience as I'm on the phone today. I was just going to make that note as well, Adam. I mean, obviously, locally, we have some disagreement with the decision in Berkeley, but I think for this board's purposes, we can still proceed with something like an optional appendix that local jurisdictions could adopt as the case law continues to evolve around the Berkeley case, as well as cases locally. So I don't think there's harm in proceeding with what we think is potentially acceptable under EPCA, as long as we're not, banking the base code. Should be fine.
Thanks, Carolyn. And David, I don't know if you have any more information on this, but my understanding is there's also a similar case proceeding in related to a case in New York. I forget if it's the Second Circuit or the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, but there is a similar case proceeding through that process. And potentially, depending on how that turns out, if whichever Second or Fourth Circuit, I forget which one it is, rules essentially differently than the Ninth Circuit did, then we would have a situation where you have challenges there with cross rulings. And David, I don't know if you can speak to what would happen in that situation, but
sure. So it's the Second Circuit in New York, I think.
Second, yeah.
And my understanding is they're still briefing a bunch of things there. The case isn't set up exactly ideally, and there's a motions practice going on that's going to delay things a little bit. But if at the end of the day, the Second Circuit reaches a different result, well, then there's a circuit split. And typically what that means is it's a good time for the Supreme Court to step in and interpret things. As you all probably know, we've got a similar thing going on. We've got our own EPCA challenge going on here in Colorado that I won't talk a lot about, but there are a lot of cases going on nationwide.
Yeah. So thanks, David. And I guess just to clarify again, that will again have no real change on what the Energy Code Board can do given our statutory limitations.
Not one bit. That's exactly right.
Yeah, but just for consideration of what Carolyn was mentioning about if local jurisdictions want to adopt something that is more stringent, that those case implications could have an effect on, well, not could, will have an effect on what jurisdictions can do.
They will have an effect on what local jurisdictions adopt. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So just for clarity, if the Energy Code Board chooses to move forward and adopt any one of the appendices or even potentially any of the resources, and that gets voted on to a final vote through the whole process, then everybody in the state is required to adopt that at that whatever period of time they're required to, and not be able to delete those if we choose to local jurisdiction, as compared to the normal process that we go through right now, with Adopt the Energy Code or any of the other codes that I adopt and pick and choose different appendices. Is that correct, the way this is going? Just for clarity, I think for discussion of the board as we move forward for discussing these and deciding to approve or adopt, I guess.
That's correct, Tim. So anything that is adopted as part of the model low energy and carbon code, when jurisdictions update their codes, they will be required to adopt that as a minimum, and they will not be able to weaken the requirements. So that is why the Energy Code Board, for example, will not be adopting an all electric requirement, because we cannot require that per statute, both in this code as well as like requiring any local government to adopt those requirements. And so those, if the Energy Code Board decides to adopt, say, this resource, but as an optional appendix, then it would still fall on the jurisdiction to adopt that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that what you just said just answered my question. Thanks.
Yep,
Yep, mine
Andrew,
too.
Andrew, did you have another question?
Yes, Adam. Are you or is the board sufficiently comfortable with the statutory limitation that in of itself is adequate for this discussion, or have you, or is it the intent of the board, or can the board seek a position statement or some paper to review this, what may be tested in the courts as far as limitations or potential limitations?
So I think ultimately, I guess in answer to your question about comfort of the statute, I don't know that there is any comfort or not comfort. The statute is what the statute is. And we will follow the statute as it is written. As far as any kind of position statement or determination, my view is that it would likely have to be on a case-by-case basis, that it doesn't necessarily make sense to create some sort of overarching like policy decision, because ultimately that's what the statute is doing, and we will be following the statute. And then if there are questions about, say we are considering this provision or this appendix, if there are questions about whether or not that meets statutory intent, or if there are any questions about if there is any risk of preemption, we could certainly address those questions as those provisions are being discussed. But I'm not sure that there's anything more overarching we can do than that.
And if I can chime in, certainly I'll do whatever you all ask me to do. That said, I agree with Adam that this kind of thing would probably come up on a case-by-case basis. And also, in the big picture, our statute is drafted in such a way, and the Berkeley decision was handed down in such a way, that it's hard to think of a situation where you could be complying with our statute and run afoul of Berkeley.
Right, I would agree with that as well. Cool. Anna, I guess we can keep going.
Before we go on to the residential, do we want to go over Tim's other questions around the commercial code, or do we want to wait for Hope?
Anna, maybe we wait till the more like open Q&A session once we get towards the end.
Great. Okay, residential. Okay, so there were a few changes. In section R405, they updated the percentage annual energy cost savings requirements. So buildings with a fuel burning appliance for space heating or water heating require at least 20% savings as compared to the standard reference design. And buildings without a fuel burning appliance will only require 15% savings as compared to the standard reference design. Next slide. The update here is that for each dwelling unit with greater than 5,000 square feet of living space above the grade plane, the annual energy cost of the dwelling unit shall be reduced by an additional 5% of the annual energy cost of the standard reference design. So, for example, a a residence with fuel burning appliances would be required, greater than 5,000 square feet would be required to have 25% savings. And an all electric residence greater than 5,000 square feet would be required to have 20% savings. They also added a requirement that the thermal conductance of the building envelope cannot be more than 15% worse than what is allowed prescriptively. So you calculate the total thermal conductance of the envelope as a whole, you are allowed to be 15% worse than the code prescribed thermal envelope. Go ahead, Carolyn.
So I always hate the cost one. And so I'm just curious if there's any thoughts around our ability to change it to performance based, meaning energy use rather than cost.
You asking the board as a whole for me?
I mean, I guess so. Anna, maybe a question would be, I believe the simulated building performance is the entire pathway is essentially based on energy cost, right? And so I think, Carolyn, to your question, I think it would take a complete reworking of that. And I think, in terms of understanding back to the, limitations on strengthening versus weakening as well, we'd have to understand, like, if you rework it in that way to make sure we're not necessarily actively strengthening that requirement. But I guess in the question of, is it possible? I think anything is possible. Is it, how difficult would it be, Anna? I mean, I guess maybe I would more defer to you on how difficult that would be.
Difficult, in my opinion. So right now, there's multiple ways to, multiple different types of utility rates that you can use when you're energy modeling. And some create a larger disparity between the cost for electricity and the cost for natural gas, and some create a smaller disparity. And it is essentially up to the energy modeler if they're using local utility rates or the EIA rates, or how that's done. And the amount of savings that we see, if we look at some other local codes that are using energy use intensity in lieu of cost, those savings are significantly different. It's not an apples to apples comparison that we can easily update the language to reflect without quite a bit of analysis. And it seems to be outside of the scope of the appendices.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just want to name it because we do have a couple jurisdictions that have moved to an energy-based version of the energy models, as opposed to the costs for the issues identified around that. They've also adopted all electric requirements. And so just wanted to name that as something for us to at least recognize, even if we can't do it in the state code. I think, Adam, for compliance purposes, I think you're going to need to recognize that there's going to be jurisdictions that have adjusted this requirement in both the base code and the optional appendices.
Yeah, and for clarification, Carolyn, I mean, if the board decides you all want to do that, I think we will figure out a way to do it. It's just a matter of how much work it will take, and we can figure that out.
Go ahead, Kim.
I'm glad Carolyn brought up that aspect. As a rater, a HERS rater myself, I've run into that type of challenge with comparing different utilities used, trying to decrease carbon footprint while trying to decrease HERS score is not always compatible when you're using different, trying to compare different fuels, whether it's, fossil fuel or electricity. So I've run into that challenge and see it. And I don't know what the board might be able to do to address it, but I'm glad Carolyn brought it up as at least a topic for us to be aware of.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Elizabeth?
Yeah, hey everybody. Sorry, I'm joining from my phone today, so hopefully this works. R405 is the whole building modeling methodology. And Anna, unless something's changed there, I think for the most part, we We don't get to claim any savings for the HVAC system itself. I believe it is modeled identically in the baseline and the proposed. So the way that this methodology ends up working is that it's almost impossible to get the percent savings required if you have gas heat. In fact, I think it might be impossible. Just based on the energy cost. So I also don't know that any jurisdiction has modified R405 to be energy use rather than energy cost. Doesn't mean it might not happen in the future, but we don't have any that have done so yet. So I do still see this methodology as written, definitely incentivizing electrification. I don't think it's even feasible with a gas project. So I wouldn't put this on my top 10 list of things to worry about just yet. Like we've got a lot of other things to worry about.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Ron?
I just want to just double check my thinking on this. So every jurisdiction is going to be required to adopt this code or something stricter. We can't weaken it. But would a jurisdiction be able to simply eliminate this pathway entirely? Because I think there's sort of this implication that the pathways are considered to be equal. So I think maybe a jurisdiction could just eliminate this cost pathway entirely without it being considered a weakening of the code. Is that right?
That's a great question, Ron. I think yes, because the prescriptive or the ERI path, as you said, would still be in place. And to your point that I don't think it always results in them, all the pathways being exactly equal, but I think the intent is generally that they are roughly equal. And so I think as a general concept, as long as there are equally restrictive requirements in other pathways, then yes, a jurisdiction could amend out a pathway.
Or stricter, right? They could,
or stricter, equally or more strict. Yeah, for sure.
So that would address what Caroline raised as some of the concerns about this cost pathway being problematic for some jurisdictions, is we could just amend it out.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Next slide. Okay, so the ERI pathway in section C406, R406, there were a couple of updates. So the ERI, not including OPP, and then the ERI with OPP are slightly different than what we saw in the draft. We have 54, 53, and 52. Not including OPP, and OPP is on-site power production. And then the ERI with OPP is 43, 43, and 46. Again, same note as we saw in section R405, that the thermal conductance of the building envelope cannot be more than 15% worse than what is allowed prescriptively. Should find a better way to phrase that. Okay, so section R408 had some big changes. In this section, we have a whole bunch of allowable pathways. So we still are going to require 10 credits. 5 additional credits are going to be required. So you're going to be required to have 15 credits if you are a dwelling unit with more than 5,000 square feet of living space above grade. And I've listed through all the credits that are available, all of the, I guess, measures that are available in Colorado's climate zones. There are some measures available in other climate zones, but not in the colder climate zones. So we have a % reduction in envelope thermal conductance as compared to the prescriptive requirements. So whereas the performance pathway and the ERI pathway allowed for a worse thermal envelope, you will now get credits under R408 for a better thermal conductance. And those credits are, a reduced thermal conductance. And those credits increase based on the percent reduction in thermal conductance. And then we have more efficient glazing. So there's a table in section R408 that references U factors and solar heat gain coefficient where 1 credit is available. You have roof solar reflectance index. There's 0 credits available above climate zone 2. There you go. Reduced air leakage above what is required prescriptively, you get credits. And those credits are only available in climate zone 4 and 5, not 6, 7, and 8. Ground source heat pumps, you get quite a few credits. High performance cooling. If you have high performance cooling, or you have a high performance gas furnace, or you have high performance gas furnace and high performance cooling, or a high performance heat pump, there are credits available. The level of performance upgrades are referenced as options. And with those different options come additional credits if they are available in our climate zone. Efficient water heating. So providing the condensing gas storage water heaters, providing instantaneous gas water heaters, providing more efficient electric water heaters or a solar hot water heater system, as well as providing compact hot water distribution. Well, there's another slide for more options. Compact hot water distribution is available, ductless or hydronic thermal distribution. Ductwork all being located within the conditioned space gets you a few points, as well as the option to provide 80% or greater of the ductwork inside the conditioned space gets you some points. Reduced duct leakage, an ERV or HRV installed. And then reduced infiltration with ERV also gets you additional points. On-site renewable energy, and then demand responsive thermostat also has a point available. So a lot of pathways through section R408 now. Any questions or concerns about those pathways?
One in the chat, Anna, is there a limit to the combined amount of credits?
There is a minimum that you need to reach, which is 10. I did not add up all of the available credits in the different climate zones. I think the difficulty here is going to be, I don't know if the total is the same for each climate zone, but the credits differ based on your climate zone. So it could be that climate zone 7 only has, I don't know, I'm going to take a wild guess and say 60 credits available. It's probably more than that, 80 credits available. Whereas climate zone 4 could have 95 credits available. We would have to double check and see the maximums in each climate zone. Okay, and then we have no significant updates to the appendices, but we do have the resources now. Oh, I'm sorry, we do have a couple of changes. Those are coming. Everything's a little bit out of order still. And I did this in the order that was received. So a resource RRA requires all electric new construction. No notes, that was it. No real exceptions there. Appendix RF, there are now additional tables that help you calculate the U factor of your thermal envelope components. So you don't have to prescribe specific R values that are listed for continuous or stud cavity insulation values that are listed in the prescriptive tables, you could adopt these references to calculate the total U factor. Next slide. Appendix RJ, we now have the demand responsive water heating, and that is only required for electric storage water heaters with a volume of 40 to 120 gallons. Next slide. And that was it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Anna. Before we jump into our sort of open Q&A session, just want to make sure that there are no other questions from the board for Anna. And I think Hope has joined us as well on any of the appendices or major changes that we just talked through. Check in the chat. Okay. All right. Well, in that case, I think what we can do is move into our open Q&A session. So we have really from now until the end of the hour to open the floor to the board to ask any questions that you might have around the 2024 code. We would love to keep these conversations somewhat organized between commercial and residential, so we don't get our wires too crossed between what's happening in this big code between both building types. So I think we'll aim to start with commercial and then kind of shift into residential. And it's okay if you ask out of order or out of out of session, I guess, with these, but just sort of a general thought to help keep us a little bit organized and make sure everything is really clear coming out of this. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen because I don't have anything else exciting to show you guys except for that slide. And we'll go ahead and open the floor. And if we don't have any questions right away, we did receive a number of questions from Tim, so we can dive right into those. Otherwise, we'll kind of sprinkle those in as we go through. So with that, I will pass it over to the board. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll dive in. Well, maybe we need a Tim question to get us started today.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll go ahead. I think maybe question number 1 from that Tim sent over. So this is on the commercial code. Do all of the minimum efficiency levels in C403 and C404 tables coincide with the DOE minimums? And Anna or...
And Hope, go ahead and correct me if I'm wrong. But the latest information I could find is that DOE has adopted ASHRAE 90.1 2019 as the federal minimums. And some of these efficiency requirements may be slightly more efficient.
Yeah. The 2021 took the values that were in ASHRAE 90.1, which were the federal minimums for it. So I believe there are a couple that are slightly above what's already there, but there's nothing below what the DOE federal minimums are.
Great, thank you both. Tim, did that answer your question? You can give me a thumbs up. Okay, awesome.
And can I ask a clarifying question just to make sure our terminology is consistent? When you say above and below, is above more stringent and below less stringent?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Tim's next question. Do you want me to ask them, Kim, so you don't have to mute and unmute?
Go for it.
Tim's next question was around section C405.2. If everyone would please open their textbooks. Exception 1. What does could endanger occupancy, safety, or security mean, and who has to determine that? Tim, that is a great question. So typically, and Hope, go ahead and jump in if you'd like to. Typically, in my experience, we have relied on the jurisdiction to determine if the exception was taken properly by the design team. So if they exclude lighting controls in the parking garage, which we're talking about in this section, we would they could potentially say that we don't want to allow the lights to dim in this area because the foot candles get too low and that endangers occupant safety. But the exact kind of language around what level endangers occupant safety or security is, I think, up for debate within the jurisdiction. Go ahead, Ron.
Well, I was just going to say, let me add to that real quick, because I have the fun of sitting in the subcommittee as we discuss this for weeks on end. I'll be quite honest with you. And so the idea was, the reason why it is so vague is because it allows the AHJ basically the best opportunity to determine, because there isn't a one size fits all. And so we have to allow for the jurisdiction to be able to determine it. That's why it's incredibly vague. And Anna's right. The idea is that the code official is basically going to have the final say. And that was what the discussion was throughout all those weeks. So.
Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I was going to say something along similar lines as to what I expected that to be. Just, there's all sorts of language in the code that says, if there's a conflict in the code, it's up to the code official to make a determination about, how to best protect the health and safety of the occupants. And, I would see this being just, they're just being explicit about it. But I think it would, it sort of seems like a catch-all that allows for circumstances that were not readily anticipatable by the people who wrote this code.
Great. Agree. Okay. Comment number 3 was about section R 405.15. So we are discussing the on-site renewables that are required. So Tim's question says, if meeting some or all of the exceptions for on-site renewables, it says you need to go to off-site renewables, in particular buildings under 5,000 square feet. We heard that it is extremely difficult to get off-site renewable certificates in the Denver metro area in a timely manner, which would affect permitting timeframes. Also, what if a site that meets one of the exceptions has an area to provide on-site renewables on their site, covered carports, etc.? Is this acceptable? Maybe clarify code language. Yeah, so I agree that it is, and we've talked about this, that off-site renewables are really difficult to come by, but I think that pushes buildings towards having to purchase RECs, unfortunately. And there's a whole section about how the RECs can be bought and what the requirements are, and an equation to calculate the RECs, but essentially you're purchasing that power from somewhere else. Go ahead, Ron. Sorry.
So Boulder County has been managing offsite renewable requirements for many years, and we essentially end up taking things, we try to encourage people to submit it with their building permit application, but often the timing, as you point out, doesn't work for that. And we just manage those conditions through the construction process. Sometimes they're before rough conditions, sometimes they're before final conditions, but we just use the conditions of the building permit to manage the timing of the offsite, and make sure that we're trying to get it accomplished before we get to occupancy. There have been a couple of cases where it's gone to occupancy, and we've even gone so far as, in a couple of rare circumstances, to manage it with a temporary certificate of occupancy. That's problematic for a variety of reasons. We don't like to do that, but I would say, just in general, it's managed through the building permit conditions is the primary way you get that.
Thanks, Ron. I think the other part of this question that I needed a little bit of help understanding, Tim, is that if a site meets one of the exceptions, has an area to provide on-site renewables on their site, covered carports, etc., is this acceptable? Go ahead, Ron.
Just to add, Boulder County, we don't distinguish in terms of energy code compliance between where a renewable energy system is installed on the site. If it's connected to the meter, it's connected to the meter. We don't care if it's on the building, on the ground, on an accessory structure. Obviously the permit requirements might vary a little bit for those things, but in terms of meeting the energy code, if it's connected to the meter, that's good enough.
Go ahead, Tim.
Tim, do you want to go maybe ask a follow-up question, and then Adam will go to you.
Yeah, I just put in the chat. I would agree. I think we would just need some clarifying language added. I'd hate to say this, an exception to the exception, because that's terrible code language, being involved in code change. But I think we need to clarify that, in particular on any of those buildings exceptions, whether it's got too much up on the roof or, the smaller size.
Hi, can I get a golden?
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, that's a great point. Go ahead, Adam.
I was just going to note that in our solar readiness requirements, you may all recall that there is the allowance that the solar readiness can be on the building or on an accessory structure on the property. And I would imagine that given that we did that in that language, I would imagine that if we maintain the solar requirements, which I know we've also discussed potentially not maintaining those anyway, but if we did, then I think, Tim, it seems that we could align that similarly to have similar language.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, just on the topic of the offsite solar and the timing around that, just to share Denver's experience with this. Of course, offsite solar is one of the options to meet the Denver Green Buildings Ordinance, formerly known as the Green Roof Ordinance. And I can share that since the Green Buildings Ordinance went into effect, what was that, 2018? I think it was. Not a single project has been able to use that method of compliance, not one. So I think that should be pretty telling about the timing issues, because we've had lots of projects try, and not a single one has been able to lock that in, partly because of the timing and partly because of the availability. So I think that just needs to be kept in mind, that it is an issue when it comes to both of those things.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Great. Any other comments on the section R 405.15 or any other questions in particular? Okay. Tim's next question is about section C 406.1. Does section C 406.1 exception number 3, I don't know if I don't think it's the exception. I think it's just number 3. Yep. Apply to first time tenant finish permits. Same for section C 406.1.1.2. So go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Hope.
Oh, I was just going to say, so what they were trying to capture, because if you remember in the old version of, or I should say the 21 version, they had the concept of tenant spaces, and people were confused about what a tenant space is, not understanding that without the definition, it was just the very first tenant that was going into that space, because after that it becomes an alteration. And so their thought process was, let's make it a little bit easier when we start talking about the concept of the core and shell, what's required at core and shell and what's required when that space is going to have its tenant in. So they decided to utilize the terminology of build out construction because they are not necessarily those that are very familiar with how maybe construction terminology is utilized, and that was the phrase that made its way through.
Does that answer your question, Tim? Great. Okay, any other questions around the applicability of section C406 or the general requirements? There is one more, while you guys are thinking about section C406 a little bit, Tim had one more section C406 question, which is, it appears that the maximum flow rates in C406.2.3.5 are less than the 2024 IPC. And yes, I agree, these are an optional efficiency package. So you have the option to provide additional efficiency by providing lower flow rates. Any other questions about, I know section C406 is a little bit of a bear now. Any other questions around the optional packages in C406, what they mean, the points, the charts, the tables? Okay, if you think of them, you can email them to me. Question 6, section C503.3.6 says to make sure, oh, this one is an interesting one. To make sure, not that the other ones weren't, Tim. I just thought this one was more interesting.
Yeah, I got a great response for that one.
Sorry. Says to make sure curb height is high enough. So let's read section C503. Oh, we have it up. So for roofs with insulation entirely, so hold on, let me back up a little bit. Section C503.3.6 is in the, sorry, can we scroll up to the top of section C503.3. Sorry. Oh, it's okay. So section C503 is alterations, and then can we go to 503.3? Is heating and cooling systems. So this is talking specifically around rooftop units for alterations. So section C503.3.6 says to make sure curb height is high enough for adding future rigid insulation. Who determines that, and what if the code keeps requiring higher R values? Also, it would be a huge cost to raise curbs, crane cost, adding ductwork, etc. I think the important part in this section is that it states that it's always so hard to read with the gray words in the background. For roofs with insulation entirely above the deck, and where existing roof mounted mechanical equipment is replaced or new equipment is added, the existing roof does not comply with the insulation requirements for new construction. Curbs for added or replaced equipment shall be of a height necessary to accommodate the future addition of above deck roof insulation to be installed in accordance with section C503.2.1 item 2. Alternatively, the curb height shall comply with table C503.3.6, curb height measured from the top of the curb to the top of the roof deck. My understanding of this section, and Hope, go ahead, jump in if I'm wrong here, is that the requirement, if we go to section C503.2.1, they talk about the bringing insulation up to the re-roof, or above a roof, so roof replacement or roof repair or alteration. My understanding is that the curb would have to be raised to comply with the roof insulation as it is currently written. You can't predict if the code in 2030 is going to require R100 roof insulation, right? But you can raise the curb to allow it to provide the required R30 above deck insulation. Kevin has another comment that said this is a good one, particularly for municipalities like Boulder that are super detailed about screening of mechanical equipment. If you raise the curb, would you have to raise the screening? That's a great question, Kevin. So, oh, go ahead.
Yes,
Caroline.
yes, Kevin. I'll just say yes, Kevin.
I knew you'd say that, Carolyn. It's just, there's, it's one of those unintended consequence things, right? Like I get where it's coming from, but especially with the wind loads and everything we face up there, tacking 6 inches on because there's 6 inches of insulation required. It's pretty hard to do.
The other thing to keep in mind, and I'm not naysaying, is while there was mention of curbs and adding ductwork and so forth, that you may have to consider the structural components of it, of whether that added weight can be added to that existing roof as it stands.
Great questions. Tim, did we answer your question in the long way around?
Yes, and I'll leave it at that.
Yes, and we added
I'm not
more questions.
If I was just going to the 2024 without the state, this would be one where I'm amending out, but I don't think I'm gonna have that choice.
The next question is on section C 505.1, the change of occupancy rules. So this one, I think this was a just kind of ugly formatting here, Tim. So it says, what about the change in occupancy from other occupancies with alterations? So you'll see that blue text right there. Spaces undergoing a change in occupancy from group F, H, S, or U occupancy classification shall comply with section C 503. Buildings or portions of buildings undergoing a change of occupancy without alterations shall comply with section C 505.2. And then if we scroll down to section C 505.1.1, it says that alterations made concurrently with any change of occupancy shall be in accordance with section C 503. So I think it's a poorly constructed section, unfortunately. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I didn't see that other part.
Yeah.
And I would suggest we clean that language up and
Agreed.
make it easier to read for the lay person, so to speak.
Agree. I read through it a few times before I saw it too, so. Appendix CC, what is the difference between this and section C 405.15? So if we remember, section C 405.15 requires the on-site renewable energy. Appendix CC requires enough renewable energy, on-site renewable energy, off-site or RECs, to offset all of the predicted energy use of the building. So it's requiring additional on-site renewable energy. And that language is listed in section CC 103.1. So on-site renewable energy shall be installed or adjusted. Off-site renewable energy shall be procured to meet the minimum renewable energy requirement in accordance with equation CC-1. Which is renewable energy on-site plus renewable energy off-site is greater than or equal to renewable energy minimum. And renewable energy minimum is either, where's that language? But it's basically you're either calculating it using table CC 103.1, which is the prescriptive table, or you are using an energy model to calculate your predicted energy use. That was a long way of saying Appendix CC requires net zero energy, and Section C4 of 5.15 just has a minimum on-site renewable requirement. I think this is one of those things where because we're reading the strike-through version, it can be really difficult to figure out what is going on. Appendix CD note says that this is assuming 2027 and 2030 IECC will reduce energy use each by 15%. So I think here the intent behind, and Hope, go ahead again and interrupt me, but the intent behind Appendix CD is that this is a way to increase the energy efficiency of the code while taking those steps towards that net zero new construction by 2030. So the idea here is that this is increasing the efficiency, and then when you adopt the glide path under the 2027 IECC, you'll get 15% better until you get to 2030. Does that answer your question? Go ahead, Hope.
I was just going to say there was a requirement that a glide path or a way to get to net zero by 2030 is basically charged to the committees. And so this was the option that made the most sense in being able to utilize the next few adoptions to get to net zero.
Thanks, Hope. Okay. The next question is Appendix CE does not apply to all occupancies. Why? So Appendix CE is the optional appendix to require additional efficiency through that required HVAC total system performance ratio, the TSPR. The TSPR calculation has quite a few limitations, and one of those limitations, and Hope you might know more about TSPR than I do, but one of those limitations is around the modeling of the occupancies. So modeling the correct end uses or plug loads within the building and what's available within the TSPR structured calculation to really calculate the correct total system performance ratio for the building. TSPR has quite a few exceptions, just different, and they're listed in section C409 now, but just listed in the different, based on the different types of equipment you have, and TSPR it's a difficult one to really wrap my head around. Anything to add there, Hope?
Nope, I think you pretty much hit it.
Last one, Appendix CI 103, why is it not applying to A or R occupancies? That's one we talked about before, but Hope you weren't here. I don't know the answer to this, but in my research, I found that this is potentially because of the lighting requirements within assembly occupancies, and then also the leasing requirements that come with residential occupancies and enrolling your building occupants in a demand responsive heating and cooling scenario without their consent, kind of. I don't know. And then for group I occupancies, institutional occupancies, I think there it's the strict requirements that those buildings have around lighting and heating water, and making sure that the occupants of those buildings are not receiving any sort of disruption to the services being provided. Did you have anything else on that one, Hope?
No, the demand response was very heavily discussed on the commercial side. And when you start, part of the discussion was for this, as far as the residential occupancy concept is, they should have the choice in their quote unquote own home, whether or not this works, considering many of them have to have their own meters. So it's not a building wide concept. And so that was partially why the R occupancies. And as far as the assemblies, I know we discussed it, but it wasn't something that resonated with me as much as the concept of the R occupancies, because that was very heavily discussed as to whether it made sense and whether we should be mandating that somebody who kind of has no control about a lot of things is going to have that taken from them. So that's about all I can add.
Yeah, thanks. That's good insight, Hope.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our pre-sent questions. And so again, turning it back over to the board, if an understanding that it was a beefy code book and it is okay. I know how busy you all are if questions haven't percolated to the top of your mind through your review. But if any questions have come up through today's discussion, or if there are sort of generalized questions you all want to ask, we would be happy to take any of those right now.
And thank you, Tim, for starting the conversation. That was really helpful.
And I'll say if we don't have any questions, oh, there we go. Thanks, Ron.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, it's a huge document. There's a lot in there. And I guess I'm just kind of curious what our plan of attack might be for how do we get from where we are right now to where we need to be? Is there a strategy that we might think about to help us sort of? I mean, I think about the hours that it takes to write a code like this. I don't think this committee has that same kind of time. We do have a little bit more time than we thought when we first set out on this, but it's still a huge document. I guess I'm just wondering, how do we start attacking this?
Adam, I'm happy to jump in with the concepts, strategies we've sort of talked about, but would welcome your additional input. So in order to try to distill this massive code book into chunks that feel manageable, we've been kind of just trying to figure out like what our approach is. And so this is sort of evolving, but and if there is any input from the board, we would welcome that at this point. Our thinking is to build out somewhat of a survey for the board to take. We're not sure if there'll be like one for commercial, one for residential, or just sort of the whole package, but structuring it in a way where you guys can go back and forth. You can start it, you can come back to the survey. And what we were thinking is to try to figure out what the right breakdown of sections in this code is, to ask the board kind of section by section, again, section size to be defined. Do you want to mess with it? Does it look fine how it is? Or do you have any other sort of suggested changes for that area, or concerns or questions about a specific piece? That survey or something akin to that would absolutely take quite a bit of board time. But I think what we wouldn't necessarily be asking for the specifics of what changes you might want to see in each one of those, but asking that you have generally looked at the section and you've said, I don't know that I like this, or I think I want to change it, or I think I just want to leave it alone. The goal with that format and that approach would be that we can get insight from you all as to what sections we should dive into. If there are sections of this code where everyone is like, I don't like it and we need to change it, we could focus our energy there. And then similarly, if there are sections where the board is aligned around, this looks good, let's not touch it, we can move more quickly through those sections when we get to our discussion. Trying to recognize our limited time and capacity within these meetings. So that's sort of the initial approach. Adam, anything to add before I turn it over to Carolyn?
I think the only thing I would add is just that, I think to Kim's point of, we're not going to necessarily, Ron, we're not going to review every single provision of the 2024 code as a group, right? I mean, that's part of the advantage of having kind of this, structure where you have a survey that allows us to kind of gauge information on where are the areas where we really need to focus our efforts. And then I think, so that's kind of when you're just talking about 2024 base code, right? And then I think there will be kind of a separate, it may be within the same survey, but like a separate effort that it's like looking at, okay, we've now identified kind of the areas that are within the 2024 as it exists that we really want to focus our time on. Also, then now within the appendices and the resources, what are the areas within those that we really want to focus our time on to consider adoption or modification of those appendices as they exist for consideration for adoption in the base code? And so I think that it will kind of be structured into those two buckets, and that will, I think, a lot of that work and that review and that consideration. I think to what Kim said, we may not necessarily be saying like, hey, please write your preferred version of what this would say, but we might be looking for like, what kinds of changes, if you're not happy with this, or in the base code, what kind of changes would you like to see? If you are considering this appendix, do you like it in the form that it is in? Do you want to see modifications to it? Just to get some of those kind of areas where we can really narrow in our focus, because up to this point, a lot of it has just been try to be open-ended just so we can start getting, have people ask questions, getting initial thoughts. But then I think once we've gotten past that point, we really need to be able to hone in on those issues that we really want to spend the bulk of our time talking about and addressing, right? And so I think that is where these surveys are going to be really important, so that we're not spending a bunch of in-meeting board time trying to wade through things that nobody really wants to talk about or nobody really thinks we need to change or address, and that we're really able to focus those meeting times on those issues that really need to be discussed and hashed out.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, Carolyn.
Yeah, no, thank you. I like the idea of a survey, but I have a little maybe proposed amendment to it. I think we'd be well served to maybe identify maybe the big, hairy, overarching topics before diving into individual sections. And I say this because, I obviously have some thoughts that I've expressed in previous meetings around the solar requirement and where we may or may not want to go as a board. And I could imagine that if we could resolve those, identify that and resolve it before then diving into the individual sections and saying, what do you like or what do you not like about this, could help make people either, less concerned or be able to focus more on other aspects of the code. Because I know that there's just a few big ones in there that are probably the most contentious or concerning issues. And maybe we could take 2 swipes at the survey.
Carolyn, I appreciate that. And I like that approach. And to share a little bit more, the reason you all haven't seen a survey from us at this point is because you just got the code. And so we really were trying to be thoughtful about not putting so much work on you all's plate that you had to review a 1,000-page document in 1 week. Our goal is to, as we build out this survey, and Carolyn, we can absolutely do so with those kind of high-level topics in mind as a section of that survey, to give you all around 3 weeks to complete it. So our goal is to, as we move through the next couple of Energy Code board meetings, which are a public engagement meeting and then a public engagement debrief, that since we won't have, strictly dove into code discussions at that point, that you guys can use that time between meetings to look at the code, to complete the survey, and to give us your initial input. And then before we dive into the specific conversations related to commercial or residential code, we plan to have a meeting where we just look at the survey results together and hash out where are there major differences. Carolyn, that would be a great meeting to talk about, those hairy overarching topics. Where do we want to land with those as a board as far as our approach to those? So we will have a full I just want to let folks know we will have a full 2 hours dedicated to that conversation before we even start talking about like what changes do we want to make to the code as well. So, but with that format, we're hoping to really set everybody up with the same expectations when we dive into our commercial and then residential code discussions. This is what we're going to talk about. This is what we're not going to talk about. And so we can, again, as Adam said, really focus our very precious meeting time together to make sure we get this done.
I guess the only thing I will emphasize in addition to that is that that's why it's so important to start reviewing the code now, and start getting a sense for where you all feel about things that are the most important for us to focus on. Because ultimately, Kim alluded that, you might have 3 weeks to fill out that survey, but you'll have like 5 weeks, a month at least before that ongoing now to start at least, doing some of that review and having, working out what your initial thoughts are on the areas that are the highest priorities. And then that will help focus. I think this is kind of an iterative process of narrowing and then narrowing again and then narrowing again, because we can't take something that's as beefy as this code and just go right into the nitty gritty right away. So Carolyn, I appreciate, what you said about, I think, starting kind of we're at the whole code level right now. And that's what we're asking you all to do, is just review the entire code and start identifying those priority areas for you that you want to discuss, or that you want to advocate for, or that you want to advocate against, whatever it may be. And then we'll kind of narrow it down to those broader topics, and then we'll narrow it down to specific sections, and then we narrow it down to the language of those specific sections, and we kind of have to work through it in that iterative process. And so that's why we are just asking that all of you, I totally appreciate that you all are extremely busy, and that's why over this time, I think that's where it's really important that if you take off little chunks, start reviewing a little bit at a time. Hopefully it won't be so much of a bear then you find yourself in a position of, I need to fill out the survey and I have 3 weeks and I haven't looked at this code yet. That's going to make it, of course, a lot more challenging. So
thanks, Adam. And thanks for that question, Ron. I appreciate you asking. Does, quickly reflecting on that approach, similar to Carolyn's comment, do any other board members have any thoughts or ideas they want to share with us at this point before we've started to piece together what that survey looks like, that can help us kind of develop that structure? Yeah, Kevin.
It's not directly an answer to that, Kim, but I wondered if, as the folks that are most familiar with this from a development point of view have gone through, it's one thing to read through and understand the code in its current state. It's a much bigger issue for somebody that's not as familiar with the code to understand how it changed. And I wonder if those familiar with the process of following it from 21 to 24 can highlight things that maybe were particularly contentious in the review approval, or at which compromises were reached to gain that broader consensus. Could kind of highlight to our attention to, hey, look at this one in 21, look at this one in 24, and see what maybe where it was headed. And the final form that we got, of course, got altered a lot in the last. So we kind of don't know what was in there in terms of aspirations on the table. And then maybe the other part of that question is, how do we feel that this is tracking towards our overall goals in Colorado? If we adopt this thing as it is, where does it put us on that graph that we're also familiar with of tracking to zero? And if it's not doing a good job, I think we did this in the previous code where we said, hey, if we focus on these 5 things, you have a chance to move that line to get us closer to a zero goal. So that, from a happy to do the research, and it's great to have a big thing to learn, but focused learning areas would be helpful as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that comment. And Adam, maybe that's something we can, and Anna and Hope, we can work offline to put together some sort of resource for you all that kind of outlines what those major changes were. And then Kevin, to your point, as the code was being updated, what were like the biggest, hairiest items that the ICC was managing? And so you all can kind of have that background as we're looking at the different sections of code. So we'll coordinate that offline and try to get you all something sooner than later to help inform that review. Hope says 18 months of meeting every week for 3 to 6 hours. So more than this board is doing, that's for sure.
Yeah, sorry. Tim asked how long it took us on the committee to write it. So I was responding to him and I didn't realize that it was on host and panelists. So my apologies.
No, thanks for clarifying. No worries at all. All right. Any final thoughts or questions from the board? Otherwise, we can jump into our next steps. Yeah, Rob.
Oh, sorry. Hey, I was wondering, I don't know if we've covered this, but what's going to be the process? I mean, we've talked about how much effort this is going to take from all of us. When we layer on there post code language from other people, what's going to be our process for deliberating on, for reviewing and deliberating on what those code proposals actually are?
That's a great question, Rob. So to draw back memories from what we did last time, and if the board liked this format, where we can certainly continue with it. If we think it needs any adaptations, we can certainly think through that. And we may have to, just depending on the complexities of what we're talking about. In previous iterations, we sort of talked, there was several rounds, right? So we would first start with like, here are the topics that the board said that they want to talk about. Let's go through each of these sections and hear at like a high level what the board is interested in changing. And that's less of a conversation around, here's the specific word I want to change, and more of a conversation around outcomes, sort of intention, general themes of the language. Our team then, again, and this is what we did last round, built code language or suggested code language to the board to accommodate those comments as we reviewed those sections. Shared that with the board, and then all the board members were responsible for reviewing that code, and if they had suggested changes to the language of any of those pieces, that's when we would ask them to submit, we would ask you all to submit proposals to change the different code sections. Coming back to the next meeting, we would then look at the actual specific proposed code language for each board member in each section, as it changed from what we may have written to what you all suggested, and go through sort of a deliberation and voting process in the meeting to discuss all of those. And then we would basically do that again. So we would update the code package, resend it out, ask for additional comments, and kind of go through that final vetting and language review at least one or two more times. So generally, that's the high-level process we took last time. I think it worked pretty well, but if board members have feedback, we would love to hear that, and happy to adapt those processes. But I think that's what we're considering again for this next round.
Sure. I guess my question was more tied to public proposals from the public, code language proposals from the public.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I think that's something we still need to, so I'll start by saying we have our public engagement meeting next, as our next meeting. And then meeting 8 will be a full meeting to debrief public engagement comments, as well as time to look at code proposals that have come through the Google form that the board might want to consider. So we'll be integrating both the sort of online comments as well as the live comments that we received, and develop an agenda to take the board through discussing and deliberating on those. And then I think we'll just, Adam and I will be monitoring the comment form online, and letting you all know as those come in. Last time we spent time at the beginning of each meeting looking at those, but we had 3-hour meetings. So maybe, Adam, that's something you and I can follow up on how to make sure we're building in time for recurring review of those outside of the public engagement debriefs.
Yeah, and then I think just in terms of Rob, like what I think we'll still figure out a little bit exactly how the board will review them, but I think once the board has reviewed them and essentially identified, do we want to proceed with this type of proposal? What do we want to do with it? It kind of then feeds into the process like of board member proposals, similar, where it kind of goes into that process. So that's kind of like the next step once the board kind of weighs in on whether or not they want to move forward.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, Tim?
Yeah, thanks. I think the big difference, in my opinion, from the first go-around that we went through is we were not looking at the nuts and bolts of the 2021 IECC, proposing any individual code changes to any of these sections like we've been talking about. for the 2024, we came up with the general code language that we did come up with the surveys and voting. And I think that's where this next phase is, I guess, going to be a lot more work, because now we're being charged with potentially going in and reviewing every section that, as Hope pointed out, took, I don't know, 12 or 14 different subcommittees, 18 months to come up with. And now we're going to be charged with trying to go back in and review those to come up with what's best for the state of Colorado. I mean, I'm not complaining. It's just, that's a big chunk of time to take to actually do this right for something that's going to end up being an adopted code across the state. So we've got our hands full. That's a minor statement.
Yeah, minor, I think, to say the least, Tim. I agree entirely, and I think that's why Adam and I are truly emphasizing the importance of you all's early review of the 2024 code to see, you know, what are sections truly that we feel comfortable as a code board that the ICC did its due diligence and that we don't want to touch, right? And so the more we can focus our conversations and our energy around which sections we do think need to be updated, the better. And so I think, yes, Tim, we have a huge task ahead of us. And I think that's where that, like, you all's sort of review and true, like, sitting down and reflecting on what do I actually care about making a change across or a change to in this code will help us drive those conversations.
And I would also just remind the board of what our statutory directive is in order to prioritize in this code. And one of them is maximizing emissions reductions. And so in your review, considering of, you know, we could tinker with all kinds of little things, but is it really going to have that? And I think back to Carolyn and Kevin's point, both of like, what is our charge? What is this helping us to do in order to actually make progress? Right. And we could tweak all kinds of little things that don't work super well or work, you know, make them better. But I think you also, in your review and in your consideration of some of these things, of what is the real impact of the change I'm proposing? Like, is the change I'm proposing small and is it significant? Or is it something like on those broader issues where it's like, this is really going to have a huge impact. This is really going to drive those emissions reductions. This is really going to drive those energy savings. This is really going to have an impact on housing affordability. Like those key kind of criteria that are the really high priorities of what this board is tasked with achieving. Those are really the things that I think, as you're thinking about what you want to propose, what you want to discuss, those need to be front and center, because otherwise we could spend, you know, not saying that every discussion isn't important, but certainly some are much smaller than others. And so what we spend our time on is going to largely should be in alignment with those overall charges.
Yeah, Will, go for it. And I just want to recognize that it is 1 o'clock. And so if folks have to jump, please go ahead. We have a couple of last slides to share, but Will, please share your final thought here.
Yeah, I was really going to chime in with something very similar to what Adam said. You know, I think we need to remember sort of our direction, which is to essentially maximize carbon emissions reductions consistent with maintaining housing affordability. And so I don't think that we should necessarily be looking at every element of IECC 2024 and think about, you know, where we might want to make adjustments down. But I would suggest that our primary, you know, considerations should probably be more what elements of appendices or resources may be appropriate to include as part of the base code, and to what extent may some of those need to be adjusted downwards.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. Okay, I won't keep you very much longer. I just wanted to quickly remind everybody around our next steps. So again, public webinars tonight. If you can make it, would love to have you there. Please remind your networks and register if you haven't yet. Our next meeting is Thursday, May 30th from 9 to 11 a.m. And this is going to be our first public engagement meeting. As usual, we'll send out meeting minutes and we'll approve those at the start of our next meeting. I did want to give you guys a small preview of how we're expecting to run the next public engagement meeting. So we will likely start with some activity to to get some generalized input from the folks who are on the call. This is going to be an activity structured to make sure we're really making these meetings accessible to folks who don't have or don't feel comfortable speaking about technical aspects of the code. We'll also be kind of diving into specific input related to equity impacts. And then for a good chunk of the meeting, we will have an open floor public comment session. So anyone interested in speaking doesn't need to register ahead of time. They can just register for the public engagement session, raise their hand when we get to this session, and they'll have around 2 minutes to share their comment. We welcome both generalized comments as well as technical code comments. And throughout the meeting, we are going to ask the board to be in active listening mode. Generally speaking, we won't have enough time for you all to sort of ask questions and respond to folks giving comment. So you'll be actively listening, and then we'll have a whole 2-hour meeting following that to discuss. So as you're listening to comments, please flag the ones you care about, or if you have questions or things of that nature, so that you don't lose all your great thoughts between both meetings. And then our goal will be to get through as many speakers as we have time for. Hopefully that's everybody. For anyone who doesn't get a chance to speak, we'll be highly encouraging folks to submit written comments through the public comment form or code proposals, depending on what they were going to share, so that we have as much as we can from the public ahead of that public meeting debrief, which will be meeting number 8. So that's all I've got. Thank you all for sticking on for an extra couple minutes with us. If any follow-up questions come up, please don't hesitate to reach out, but otherwise enjoy the rest of your Tuesdays and hopefully see you guys at 4.
Thank you all.